Looking at the modern view of what was now my empire, one thought crossed my mind. Try stepping over me now, bitches. Spoilers, the villainess wins this time. The first sensation was not the burning agony of poison slipping down my throat, nor the cold steel of the guillotine against my neck. It was the sharp, synthetic blare of an alarm clock, and the stale scent of instant coffee. I opened my eyes, expecting to see the stone ceiling of the Duke's dungeon. Instead, I stared at a water-stained plaster ceiling and a spinning, dusty ceiling fan. I sat up, a blinding headache piercing my skull. As I pressed my hands to my temples, two distinct streams of memories violently collided in my mind. I was Victoria Bennington, the undisputed, tragic villainess of a notoriously melodramatic period novel called Dahlia's Smile. I had spent my life orchestrating brilliant political maneuvers, only to be betrayed by a weak-willed duke who favored a weeping, naive protagonist over my capable hands. My reward for securing his empire had been a public execution for treason. But I was also Anne Baker, a 26-year-old executive secretary living in a cramped, overpriced apartment in a sprawling concrete metropolis. Anne was a doormat. A nervous, trembling creature who worked 80-hour weeks, survived on antacids, and was hopelessly devoted to a man who saw her as less than the dirt beneath his custom-made Italian leather shoes. That man was Arnold Harrison, CEO of Heartline Enterprises. I walked on unsteady legs to the small, poorly lit bathroom and stared into the mirror. The face looking back at me was pale, with dark, exhausted circles under her brown eyes. Her mousy brown hair was pulled into a severe, unflattering bun. She looked defeated. She looked like a victim. I closed my eyes, letting Anne's memories wash over me. The sheer volume of abuse she endured was staggering. Arnold Harrison didn't just overwork her, he verbally abused her, stole credit for her meticulous organizational strategies, and forced her to manage his personal affairs, his mistresses, and his illegal accounting practices. Anne had known about the irregularities. She was the one who reconciled the books. She saw the millions of dollars being siphoned off into shell companies. But when she had timidly brought it up, Arnold had smiled his charming, reptilian smile, patted her on the shoulder, and told her not to worry her pretty little head about grown-up business. And Anne, pathetic, desperate for approval Anne, had stayed silent. But yesterday's memory made my blood run cold, and then, slowly, boil with a familiar, intoxicating rage. Anne had accidentally overheard a phone call between Arnold and the company's chief financial officer. The board of directors was demanding an audit. Millions were missing. The SEC was sniffing around. And Arnold's solution was simple, elegant, and utterly ruthless. "Don't panic, Connor," Arnold's slick voice echoed in my inherited memory. "The paper trail is entirely tied to the secretary's terminal. Baker's signature is on the transfer authorizations. I've been using her login for months. When the auditors come down, she takes the fall. She's too stupid to defend herself anyway." A classic case of an underpaid employee embezzling funds. Anne had locked herself in a bathroom stall and hyperventilated until she passed out. She had come home, swallowed half a bottle of sleeping pills, and simply given up. That was when the soul of Victoria Bennington, a woman who knew a thing or two about being framed by incompetent, arrogant men, stepped in. I leaned closer to the mirror. The pale, frightened girl was gone. A cold, predatory smile stretched across my lips. "Oh, Anne," I whispered to the empty room. "You poor, sweet, foolish girl. You gathered enough ammunition to sink an empire, and you just sat on it. Rest now. I'll take it from here." The first order of business was discarding Anne's armor of invisibility. I flung open her closet. It was a tragedy in beige and gray. Cardigans that swallowed her figure, slacks that were 2 inches too long, sensible flats that screamed subservience. I dragged it all out and threw it on the bed. Buried in the very back, still in a dry-cleaning bag, was a single, tailored black suit. Anne had bought it for a promotion interview 2 years ago, a promotion Arnold had given to his golf buddy's nephew instead. It was sharp, fitted, and unapologetic. I showered, washing away the scent of fear and cheap soap. I applied makeup not to hide, but to strike. Sharp eyeliner, contoured cheekbones, and a shade of lipstick that was a deep, blood-red crimson. I let Anne's hair down, brushing it until it gleamed, parting it sharply down the middle. When I stepped into a pair of black stiletto heels I had ordered express delivery from a local boutique using Anne's emergency credit card, the transformation was complete. I was the executioner. I sat down at Anne's small desk, flipping open her laptop. Her password was Arnold123. I sneered in disgust and immediately changed it. For the next 4 hours, I worked. Anne was a fool when it came to human nature, but as a secretary, she was a savant. She had kept digital backups of everything. Every email Arnold told her to delete, every audio recording of his meetings, every doctored spreadsheet, she had kept them in a hidden, encrypted folder labeled, just in case. She hadn't had the spine to use them. But I had orchestrated the downfall of entire noble houses with half as much evidence. I traced the funds. Arnold had been funneling company capital into a Cayman Islands account under a shell corporation named Cardinal Solutions. He had been using Anne's credentials to authorize the transfers. But he had made one fatal, arrogant mistake. He had used his personal IP address from his luxury penthouse for the final approvals, believing no one would ever look that deep. I compiled it all. The IP logs, the original undoctored financial statements, the emails instructing the CFO to ignore discrepancies, and finally, a neatly formatted document transferring 60% of Arnold's personal voting shares in Heartline Enterprises to one Anne Baker. I printed 6 copies of the dossier and placed them in sleek, unmarked black folders. It was time to go to work. Heartline Enterprises occupied the top 10 floors of a glittering glass skyscraper in the financial district. When the elevator doors pinged open on the executive floor, the usual hum of activity faltered. Joan, the head receptionist who usually took great pleasure in mocking Anne's cheap shoes, stopped mid-sentence on the phone. Her jaw went slack. I strode. My heels clicked against the Italian marble like a metronome ticking down to doomsday. I kept my chin high, my shoulders back, the black folders tucked effortlessly under one arm. "Anne?" Joan gasped, lowering her headset. What are you wearing?" I stopped at her desk, looking down at her. I gave her a look of pure, glacial indifference. "A suit, Joan. I'd suggest you look into acquiring one. That floral blouse makes you look like a neglected sofa." Before she could close her mouth, I walked past her. Whispers erupted like a trail of gunpowder behind me. Junior executives who usually shoved past me in the hallways pressed themselves against the glass walls to let me pass. I reached the double mahogany doors of the main boardroom. Inside, the emergency board meeting was already underway. This was the meeting where Arnold planned to formally present his findings regarding the missing funds. The meeting where the guillotine was supposed to drop on Anne's neck. I pushed the heavy doors open with a sharp, violent shove. They slammed against the wall with a deafening crack. Silence fell over the room instantly. 12 board members, mostly older men in expensive suits, turned their heads in shock. At the head of the long mahogany table stood Arnold Harrison. He was handsome in a slimy, practiced way. Silver hair at the temples, a custom-tailored navy suit, the easy smile of a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. He was mid-presentation, a laser pointer in his hand, a slide titled "Internal Financial Discrepancies" illuminated on the screen behind him. His smile faltered as he looked at me. It took him 3 full seconds to recognize his own secretary. "Anne?" Arnold demanded, his voice dropping into the condescending, authoritative register he used to put her in her place. "What is the meaning of this?" "You know you are absolutely forbidden from interrupting a closed board meeting. Get out. We will discuss your insubordination later." A few board members murmured in agreement. In the past, Anne would have burst into tears, apologized profusely, and run from the room. I stepped fully into the boardroom, letting the doors swing shut behind me. I smiled. It was the same smile I had given the Duke just before I poisoned his wine. "I apologize for the interruption, gentlemen," I said, my voice smooth, loud, and echoing with absolute authority. "But considering the topic of Mr. Harrison's presentation is my impending termination and subsequent arrest for corporate fraud, I felt my attendance was mandatory." The room erupted into shocked murmurs. Arnold's face turned a mottled shade of red. "How dare you!" Arnold slammed his hands on the table. "Security! Someone call security right now." "I wouldn't do that, Connor," I said, turning my gaze to the CFO, who was sitting near Arnold, looking sweating and pale. Not unless you want them to escort you out in handcuffs instead of me. Connor froze, his hand hovering over the desk phone. I walked slowly around the massive table, the click of my heels commanding the rhythm of the room. I stopped behind an empty leather chair, resting my hands lightly on the back. Mr. Harrison was just about to tell you a very compelling story. I addressed the board, making eye contact with the oldest and most influential members. He was going to explain how his naive, overworked secretary somehow managed to bypass 6 levels of corporate security to siphon $32 million into an offshore account over the last 18 months. Because you did, you crazy bitch. Arnold spat, losing his veneer of calm. We have the digital signatures. We have the IP logs. You have my digital signatures, I corrected gently, pulling the first black folder from under my arm and sliding it across the polished wood to the chairman of the board, an imposing man named Windsor. Because you demanded my login credentials on your second day as CEO, citing a need for streamlined access, an egregious violation of IT protocol which I documented and filed with HR, a report that, strangely, disappeared. I began tossing the other folders onto the table, letting them slide toward the other board members. What you don't have? I continued, my voice cutting through the rising tension like a diamond blade. Is the secondary tracking data. Ann Baker is a loyal, simple woman. But she is also remarkably organized. Windsor opened the folder. His eyes immediately widened. Turn to page 4, gentlemen, I instructed. There was a flurry of turning pages. Arnold stood frozen at the head of the table, his confident posture crumbling as he watched the board members' expressions shift from confusion to absolute horror. Page 4 details the exact transfer authorizations, I said. Note the timestamps. They frequently occur between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Now, turn to page 7. Those are the IP logs for those exact times. They do not originate from my apartment in the Lower East Side. They originate from a private network in the Diamond Tower, Windsor read aloud, his voice low and dangerous. He looked up, staring directly at Arnold. Your penthouse, Arnold. That's fabricated, Arnold stammered, his eyes darting toward the doors. She's an expert with computers. She hacked the mainframe. I have trouble connecting to the office printer, Arnold. Let's not flatter me. I laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. Turn to page 12. Bank statements from a Cayman Island holding company called Cardinal Solutions. The sole beneficiary listed on the formation documents, complete with a notarized signature, is Arnold Harrison. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a guillotine blade being raised to its peak. And finally, I said, leaning forward, bracing my hands on the table and locking eyes with Arnold. The terror in his eyes was exquisite. It tasted like vintage wine. Page 22. A transcript of a phone conversation recorded yesterday afternoon between Arnold and CFO Connor Evans, explicitly discussing the plan to frame me for the embezzlement to placate the SEC. Connor made a strange choking sound and buried his face in his hands. Windsor slowly closed the folder. He looked like a man who was about to scorch the earth. Arnold, Windsor said softly, is this true? Windsor, listen to me. This is a setup. Is it true, Connor? Windsor snapped, turning to the CFO. Connor didn't even look up. He just nodded miserably. He said he would handle it. He said she was a nobody. I smiled. A fatal miscalculation. Windsor stood up. The board is taking an immediate recess. Arnold, you are stripped of all executive powers, effective immediately. Do not leave this building. The company's legal counsel will be joining us in 10 minutes. Miss Baker, please remain on the premises. Oh, I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Windsor, I said smoothly. Arnold and I have a brief piece of administrative housekeeping to conclude. The board members filed out of the room in a state of controlled panic, taking their black folders with them. They looked at me with a newfound mixture of fear and deep respect. Connor practically sprinted out of the room. When the heavy doors clicked shut, it was just Arnold and me. He looked deflated, leaning heavily against the whiteboard. The slick CEO was gone, replaced by a cornered, sweating rat. He stared at me as if I had grown a second head. Who are you? He whispered. You aren't Anne. Anne wouldn't do this. Anne cries when I raise my voice. I walked slowly toward him, closing the distance between us until I was standing merely inches away. I was slightly shorter than him, but in that moment, I towered over his soul. Anne is currently indisposed, I said softly, my voice dripping with venom. I am the woman who is going to ruin the rest of your pathetic life. He tried to puff up his chest, a last, desperate attempt at intimidation. You think you've won? You think you can just march in here and take me down? I have lawyers. I have friends in high places. I'll drag you down with me. I'll tie you up in litigation for decades. I laughed. It was genuine amusement. Arnold, your lawyers work for the money you stole. Money that the SEC is going to freeze before you even finish packing your monogrammed golf balls. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a single, perfectly crisp document. I slapped it against his chest. He caught it reflexively. What is this? He muttered, looking down. That is a transfer of ownership, I explained calmly, walking past him to sit directly in his leather CEO chair at the head of the table. I leaned back, steepling my fingers. You currently own 60% of the voting shares of Heartline Enterprises. That document legally transfers all of them to me, irrevocably. He looked at the paper, then at me, then burst into a hysterical, breathless laugh. You're insane. You are actually insane. Why in God's name would I sign this? Because, Arnold, I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing all trace of amusement. The folders I gave the board were the sanitized version. His laughter died in his throat. What? The board cares about the money. The SEC cares about the money. But I care about leverage, I said smoothly. If you sign those shares over to me right now, I walk away. I let the board handle the embezzlement. You'll go to a white-collar, minimum security resort for a few years, play tennis, and write a memoir. I paused, letting the silence stretch, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. But if you don't sign, I continued, I release the other folder, the one I sent to a dead man's switch on my personal server. The one that contains the offshore accounts you hid from your wife. The one that contains the blackmail material you have on 2 sitting senators, and most importantly, the hard drive full of, let's call them extracurricular recreational photos from your trips to Thailand. The color completely drained from Arnold's face. He looked like a corpse. His hands began to shake so violently the paper rattled. You couldn't have found those, he whispered, his voice cracking. Those were on an encrypted hard drive in a physical safe. You made Anne memorize the code to the safe because you kept forgetting it, I reminded him coldly. She thought it was just for petty cash. I knew better. I took a trip to the office at 3 a.m. last night. The security guard, Larry, let me right in. I brought him a box of donuts. He thinks Anne is such a sweet girl. Arnold fell to his knees. The great CEO, the master of the universe, crumpled onto the Italian marble floor, wheezing for breath. Please, he begged, tears welling in his eyes. Please, Anne, you're taking everything. The company, it's my life's work, it's all I have. I looked down at him with utter revulsion. In my past life, the men who betrayed me had at least possessed the dignity to face the executioner with their heads held high. This man was nothing but a parasite dressed in silk. Your life's work is stealing from your employees and abusing women who don't have the power to fight back. I stated flatly, you have exactly 10 seconds to sign that document, or I press a button on my phone and your life goes from a white-collar crime documentary to a federal trafficking investigation. I placed a silver Mont Blanc pen on the edge of the table. 10. He stared at the pen, paralyzed. 9. Anne, please, we can work this out. 8. 7. He lunged for the pen. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip it. He pressed it to the paper, his signature a jagged, frantic scrawl at the bottom of the page. He sobbed once, a pathetic, broken sound, and pushed the paper toward me. I picked it up, inspecting the signature. It was legally binding. I tucked it neatly into my blazer pocket. Thank you, Arnold, I said politely. It's been a pleasure doing business with you. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, unlocked it, and tapped a single icon. There, I said. Done. Arnold let out a massive sigh of relief, wiping his face with the sleeve of his suit. You deleted the other folder? Deleted? I raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. Heavens no, I just sent it to the SEC, and the FBI, and the New York Times, and your wife. Arnold stared at me, his eyes wide with an uncomprehending horror. But I signed. We had a deal. You said you would walk away. I stood up from his chair, smoothing the front of my suit. I looked down at him, letting my aristocratic, villainous soul shine through my modern eyes. I lied, I said simply. Villains rarely keep their promises, Arnold. You of all people should know that. Before he could scream, before he could lunge at me, the heavy mahogany doors burst open. 4 uniformed police officers stepped into the room, followed closely by a pair of men in cheap suits who radiated federal authority. Behind them stood Windsor and the rest of the board, looking grim. Arnold Harrison, one of the officers asked, his hand resting on his utility belt. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and wire fraud. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back. Arnold didn't stand. He remained on his knees, staring at me as if I were a demon clawing its way out of hell. She did it! He shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. She's a monster! She took everything! She's not Ann Baker! Get him up, the federal agent sighed, clearly unimpressed. 2 officers hauled Arnold to his feet, roughly wrenching his arms behind his back and snapping the steel cuffs around his wrists. He kicked and thrashed, his custom suit tearing at the shoulder, his silver hair a wild mess. You bitch, he screamed as they dragged him toward the door. I'll kill you. I'll ruin you. I stood perfectly still, offering him a serene, victorious smile as they hauled him past me. Goodbye, Arnold, I whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. Enjoy the resort. His screams faded as the elevator doors closed out in the hallway. The boardroom was silent again. The police and federal agents remained to secure the room, but Windsor stepped forward, approaching me with cautious steps. Miss Baker, Windsor said, his tone entirely different from the one he had used an hour ago. It was respectful, wary. The board owes you a tremendous apology. You saved this company from absolute ruin. If that information had gone public without us taking action first. He shuddered. We would like to offer you a substantial severance package. And excellent letters of recommendation, of course. I reached into my blazer pocket and slowly pulled out the document Arnold had just signed. I handed it to Windsor. Windsor took it, putting on his reading glasses. As his eyes scanned the text, his jaw slowly dropped. He looked at the signature, then up at me, his face pale. He signed over his shares, Windsor whispered. All 60% to you. He was feeling surprisingly philanthropic in his final moments, I said dryly. Miss Baker, this means, Windsor swallowed hard, this makes you the majority shareholder. You effectively own Heartline Enterprises. I am aware of how equity works, Mr. Windsor, I said, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the sprawling city, the glass and steel reflecting the afternoon sun. It wasn't a kingdom of castles and knights, but it would do. What are your orders, Miss Baker? Windsor asked, his voice wavering slightly. He knew the power dynamic had shifted entirely. I turned back to him. The doormat secretary was dead. The tragic Villainess was reborn, and this time, there was no naive protagonist to get in my way, and no foolish duke to betray me. I had the throne, and I intended to keep it. First, I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority, we are going to fire Joan at reception. I don't like her face. Second, summon the legal team. We need to restructure the executive board by the end of the day. I walked over to the head of the table and sat down in the CEO's chair. It was leather, comfortable, and smelled of power. I leaned back and crossed my legs. And third, Mr. Windsor, I smiled, a predator resting after a successful hunt. Get me a cup of coffee, black, and make it quick. We have an empire to run.
If you enjoyed this quick escape, hit the subscribe button for new stories, twice a week. Until then, I'll see you at the next flip of the pages.